Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of Breakfast Buzz, which we will actually call the Beetle Buzz, which brings me to the next insect pollinator that we're going to highlight this evening, and that is the beetle. People might not think of the beetle as a pollinator, and it turns out that actually it is probably one of the most important pollinators because there are so many different species of them and such a diversity of them and just abundant numbers that even though their pollination is very haphazard and kind of happenstance, ends up being quite successful overall because of the sheer numbers that exist in the world. And so one of the beetles that I would like to highlight tonight is actually the lightning beetle. Oftentimes you hear it referred to as a firefly and things like that, and it's not actually a fly, it is in fact a beetle. And so I'm hoping you might actually see some of them behind me in the yard here. We have had hundreds of them in our yard this year, and some of this is because we've taken specific actions to support lightning beetles in particular. But before I dive into what goes into an ideal habitat for beetles in particular, especially firefly beetles, I want to talk a little bit about the light display that we see them putting on. Basically, during the month of June is mostly when we'll see it, and we'll see it at this time of night, which is around 8:30, depending on the daylight hours and how that's changing through June. But we'll see it usually, the height of it will be around 8:30 until about 9 o'clock at night for specifically what is known as the Big Dipper or J-stroke firefly beetle. And this firefly beetle, the male will basically turn on his flash or his bioluminescence in a J pattern as he starts down below and then raises up, and you'll see it makes kind of a J shape. And he will do that, and then the females will respond down below, and usually they will be perched on some sort of vegetation down below, and they will orient their tip, their abdomen, with the bioluminescence or their lantern towards the male that they deem as a suitable mate, and they will flash back at him, and that is how they communicate to each other for mating. And so it's really a neat thing to watch, and I think it's kind of a cool way to wind down in the evening, to come out here. This becomes kind of my ritual in the evenings when I can do it, when I'm able to come out here, not always in a bee costume, but to sit out here and just sit in silence. One just went past my face. To just maybe play my ukulele and watch the firefly mating display. So now that we know a little bit more about their mating ritual, we can talk a little bit about what kind of habitat is desirable to them and what will foster them to thrive in your own home landscape. And so one of the things that, I keep beating on the same drum over and over again is that no insecticides, no grub killer, things like that. As much as you can avoid that as possible, please stay away from using those things. It's not good for them. Shallow native flowers are going to be best. We talked about wasps and how because they don't have they're short-tongued basically, they don't have long mouth parts or proboscis, that they're not able to get into deep flowers, and so shallow native flowers are going to be best. And of course, having something kind of through the growing season, especially when they're active, is going to be very important. Usually the numbers that I've seen thrown around are about 25% to 30% of your yard to have these flowering species to support beneficial insects is really important. Native bunch grasses for shelter and overwintering. Leaf debris, leaving some of that through the winter, that's going to be their winter coat. And their larvae actually feed on soft-bodied bugs. And so when we think of what they're going to be eating, somebody just set off a firework. They're going to be feeding, their larvae will be feeding on things like slugs or snails, things that we typically consider garden pests, sometimes even on worms a little bit. And so we will need food like bugs for the larvae to actually eat and be sustained in our yard. places to overwinter, like I said, leaf debris, rotting wood, undersides of rocks, bark, and damp areas. Damp areas are going to be where a lot of the food for the larva will actually survive. So the larva will be happiest and find the most success in food in damp areas in our yards as well. Reducing tillage or not tilling so much in your yard, or at least leaving spots that you don't till, is going to be really important because their larvae live in the ground. The more that we till, the more that we hurt habitat for things like beetle grubs and beetles that live in the ground. So this is really important, at least to give them some sort of refuge away from that. And lighting, specifically for the firefly beetles, it's important that it's kind of key that we don't have a lot of bright spotlights, and especially white spotlights in our yards. We can do kind of the low kind of yellow lights, switch out some of our white bright spotlights with something like that. Or what we do at our house is we just leave the lights off until the lightning bugs really aren't very active anymore in the evening. So usually about 9:30 or 10 o'clock, we'll turn our front porch and back porch light on, which is also a yellow hued light, so as to not disturb them too much. Something else that's really ideal for a habitat for beetles in general, and not just firefly beetles, is to have stems, leaving standing stems from last year's dormant growth. And that is something that they will actually use those stems for food, sometimes chewing, the rotting wood. That's also important because they will sometimes feed on that wood as well. They are part of the reason that wood rots. And they will actually create tunnels in some of these things. And then what is left behind is an ideal space for bees, or stem nesting bees, to actually create their nests in those spaces. And then one other thing that we can do in our yard too, in general for beetles, is to create beetle banks or beetle bumps. If you have a smaller yard, you can create something that's maybe 2 by 2 square foot, maybe 6 inches to a foot bump off of the ground, or just kind of mound in the ground, I should say, or maybe even I'll call it a berm. And basically just leave that, plant it, maybe put some wildflowers, some native wildflowers, or plant it with some bunch grasses, and that will be a place and a refuge for beetles to go. And they can use that as a hunting ground, they can use it to overwinter, they can use it for shelter, and in general to reproduce as well. So I would encourage you to try and incorporate one or more of these actions into your own home landscape, and do it for multiple years in a row, and see what kind of effect it has on your lightning bug or lightning beetle population in your own yard. That's all for me tonight. I hope you enjoyed this special edition of Beetle Buzz, and all of you be safe out there.